During this year's budget process, environmental advocates found themselves spending most of their time playing defense as they looked to hold the line against Governor Kathy Hochul's rollback of New York's 2019 law designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And while the governor appears to have won on that front, securing a delay in when regulations need to be implemented, as well as new metrics for counting methane pollution, we wanted to explore the broader playing field, including what got done or what didn't get done during the end of the legislative session here in Albany. And to do that, we're joined in the studio by Marie French, the energy and environment reporter at the Capitol for Politico New York. So Marie, when it comes to the energy and environmental policies and spending that made it into the budget, is it fair to say that most of the oxygen at the Capitol was dedicated to the governor's proposed tweaks of the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act?
Yeah, Dave, I think that's a totally fair assessment. Certainly there were other elements around energy and around, environmental policy that were part of those conversations. But really, a lot of the energy, pun definitely intended, of the folks who work on these issues was dedicated to the climate law changes. I mean, the other notable thing I think I'd mention for sure is the changes to the state's environmental permitting law. Those were also very, very significant and did take up a lot of time.
Yeah, and people who are curious what that's a reference to, they might have heard some talk about the Environmental Quality Review Act and this idea of trying to make it easier to build, particularly housing, all over the state. But when it comes to the budget and what the governor was looking for, I think it was kind of a fait accompli that she would get something on this issue. What it would end up looking like was kind of the ambiguous question during the budget process, but it also opened the door for what could the legislature get out of this, because there's a certain amount of horse trading. So did the legislature, did those Democratic lawmakers who held their nose and voted for this, did they get anything in exchange? Is there something that made it into this budget that you would point to as their victory on the environment or energy?
Well, I mean, I think, there was a bit of a nibbling around the edges, right? There was, it is true that when the governor originally, made her proposal to change the climate law, she wanted regulations not due until 2030. That was unacceptable to a lot of environmental interests and to many Democratic lawmakers. So it ended up, end of 2028 is where it landed.
And they wanted those environmental regulations, what, years ago at this point?
Well, they were technically already due. Yes,
sure.
They were overdue. Hence the lawsuit that essentially is now moot.
Mm-hmm.
So they got that. They got some changes around the edges. There's $1 billion for the Sustainable Future Fund, which will provide some immediate funding for decarbonization projects and initiatives. There was elements of what's called I don't want to bore your viewers with more acronyms, but the ASAP Act, which is essentially solar permitting and interconnection issues, as well as some funding for subsidies for solar.
And what about, sticking with money, how about green infrastructure more broadly, water? Was there any major changes into those pots, or is that kind of status quo, which is, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in capital funds for things like the water infrastructure or the Environmental Protection Fund?
Yeah, so there was historic funding for water infrastructure in particular, but a lot of that was earmarked or is earmarked for, supporting housing, which I think folks were kind of, in the end, pretty okay with, since there were some additional guardrails included beyond what the governor had initially proposed. The EPF got funded again. There was some concern from environmentalists that programs in the Environmental Protection Fund kind of got shuffled around a little bit with more earmarks in there than usual for sort of like local projects. So that's a concern, and they're kind of like hoping to not have that happen again next year.
And what about in the 2 or 3 weeks after the budget was adopted, the traditional legislative session where theoretically the legislature can lead? Did they lead on any environmental or green energy issues?
I think certainly the most significant piece of news on my beat, out of that very brief span of time that we experienced.
It felt very long, though.
It was many hours.
Yes.
It was many hours compressed into a short time period. Very fun. The data center moratorium, I think, would obviously be my, call out for the most significant piece of legislation they were able to pass on the energy front.
And what does that 1-year moratorium actually mean if the governor signs it?
Well, I mean, it does put a pause on permits for new large-scale data centers. It will slow things down if the governor chooses to sign it. It adds, a range of guardrails for future data centers to, buy renewable energy credits or potentially have new rate classes that will basically charge them more. So we'll see what the governor does. You would definitely expect her to probably seek some chapter amendments. This legislation did come together pretty late in session, so, often there's some fine tuning that ends up happening, and certainly we expect labor to push the governor to make some changes to it, in particular on the moratorium side.
Well, it seems like the change was that they went from a 3-year moratorium initially proposed to 1-year moratorium. I mean, it seems like if I'm the Democratic lawmakers, I'd say I already made my concessions at this point. Anything else is I'm just continuing to negotiate against myself.
They might feel like that, but the governor often vetoes things, and then the legislature, what, have they ever overridden a veto, Dave?
In the last quarter of a century, I don't believe they've had anything. There were some at the end of the Pataki administration where they held some votes. But yeah, like you say, I don't think this is a Democratic majority in either house that wants to go to war with the governor. But in general, do you think that there is some sort of dissatisfaction from more progressive, environmentally friendly lawmakers about the end of session and about the budget experience more broadly?
Oh, I think there's a lot of frustration, a lot of angst, a lot of disappointment. Some people are putting their positive spin on it, as they do, because, they still got to work with the governor, sort of thing. And the truth is, politically, this was all good for her, honestly. She didn't really have a whole lot of downside here. She doesn't have a progressive challenger, so there's no one pushing her to her left on environmental or energy issues. She's defending herself against attacks from Blakeman, and she doesn't really necessarily have to worry too much.
There was a conversation, and I don't know how prolific it was, but the advocates kept coming into my office and probably to you as well about slowing the development of nuclear energy in New York, which is something the governor has wanted to do and grow. Any appetite amongst the Democratic lawmakers to do that, or does that ball still seem to be in the governor's court and full steam ahead on developing new nuclear reactors and so-called advanced nuclear?
Yeah, that proposal for a moratorium on new nuclear didn't really gain the momentum that would be needed. It was a new idea, so that often, is tough to get across the finish line without, significant outside influence. But that's going to be really something to watch, because the governor's administration is moving very quickly now to get NYPA to do some contracting, or at least look at some companies that could build these new plants. The Public Service Commission will actually be taking up this issue this week to look at the 4 gigawatts that they're in charge of incentivizing.
And again, no significant action, at least from my perspective, on any efforts to promote recycling, reduce waste, especially as it pertains to single-use packaging. Is that a fair assessment, or did something sneak by that people maybe aren't appreciating enough?
So I have on my list here for forever chemicals, there was some action on, limits in drinking water as the federal government is rolling theirs back, as well as some disclosure requirements for wastewater discharges that contain PFAS. So those were 2 things that did get through. You're perfectly correct. Packaging clearly was kind of declared dead pretty early there in the last what was that, the last week of session? I can't even remember, by the speaker. And so, there was not significant action on that. Nothing on pollution from warehouses, nothing on what's called the Beauty Justice Act, which, relates to personal care products and chemicals in those. So, kind of, environmentalists had different slates, but very few of their priorities ended up passing.
Well, on that note, we've been speaking with Marie French. She's the energy and environment reporter at the Capitol for Politico New York. Marie, thanks so much for making the time.
Absolutely. It was lovely to talk with you.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided by New York State United Teachers, a statewide union of nearly 700,000 professionals in education and healthcare.